Standing tall, falling hard. It seemed like the perfect message title for this day of all days. And I want us to look at that in a couple of ways. But first, let's do just a little bit of catch up on the story. We are into a period in the history of the people of Israel that sees God leading his people very firmly through the words and actions of priests and prophets. He is speaking directly through them in order that the Israelites would know that God is on their side, that God is watching over them, God is caring for them, God is leading them, and God has their best interest at heart, as he has had for centuries now. The leaders he has chosen have led them through battles and tried valiantly to get them to follow God's ways, despite them wanting to do what they wanted to do. And we're picking up the story today with an introduction to Eli, Samuel, and Saul. Eli had been leading the Hebrew people for quite some time. He was a prophet appointed by God, and he had pleased God in many ways. But as he now got older, there came this point where he recognized he needed a successor, and his sons weren't them. It says in the Bible that they were wicked men, and God didn't want the fate of the Israelites in the hands of such as these. It says that they had blasphemed. And for those of you who wonder what that word means, and I had to look it up at some point, blaspheme, the dictionary tells us, is to speak irreverently about God, to curse, to swear, and to take the Lord's name in vain, which we know is in a contradiction to the third commandment that we read, "Do not take the name of the Lord your God in vain." And so God's upper story would progress, but not through Eli's sons. He was a good man, Eli, and he stood tall, and he followed God's word and God's ways, but he fell hard through his sons. And so enter Samuel. In a decidedly God way, he was born to a couple who seemed not to be able to have any children. His mother, Hannah, and his father had prayed to God and prayed and prayed, repeatedly putting their faith in God to give them a son. Hannah even went so far as to make a promise to God, "If you give me a son, I will give him back to you in service to you, Lord." Babies born to make a difference. That's God's way, isn't it? And he's great at it. Choosing the unlikely, an infant, to lead the next chapter in his story. Hannah had her son, and she named him Samuel, which means heard by God. And just as a little aside, coincidentally, my brother Aaron and his wife Catherine had wanted a child for a very long time and tried and tried. For 8 years they tried, using man-made methods, both here and in England, trying to have a child. And finally they chose to stop the treatments. And as these things happen, they had a son. And his name is Samuel. And it was chosen very deliberately because they knew that they had been heard by God. But back to Hannah. Indeed, she followed through on her promise, not something we always do when we make a deal with God. Get me out of this and I'll give you this. But Hannah did. She followed through, and when Samuel was old enough, she took him to the temple. She took him to Eli and put him in service to God. And his calling later on in his life, Samuel had this wonderful moment when he heard God speak to him. And I want to read to you his calling, one of my favorites. One night, Eli, whose eyes were becoming so weak that he could barely see, was lying down in his usual place. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the house of the Lord, where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called Samuel. I'm getting there. Samuel answered, "Here I am." And he ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, you have called me." But Eli said, "I did not call. Go back and lie down." So he went and lay down. Again, the Lord said to Samuel, "Samuel." And Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am. You called me." "My son," Eli said, "I did not call. Go back and lie down." Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord. The word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. A third time the Lord called, "Samuel." And Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." Then Eli realized that the Lord was calling the boy. So Eli told Samuel, "Go and lie down, and if he calls you, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. The Lord came and stood there, calling as at the other times, "Samuel, Samuel." Then Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." Samuel answers. Sometimes it takes us a while to figure out that God is calling us. We think it is something else or someone else. We like to attribute it to anything else because we know if God is calling and we answer that things are going to change. Life will change. But Samuel does answer. He goes on to become the leader of the people of Israel, intended by God. And we heard his counsel in the last part of his life. Serve the Lord with all your heart, and do not turn aside after useless things that cannot profit or save, for they are useless. Great advice. But did they listen? Of course they didn't listen. The people of Israel were notorious for not listening. Too often we hear these stories and we have to liken the people of Israel to petulant children wanting their own way. They whined to God often. They whined because they were slaves and God led them out of Egypt. They whined because they didn't have food and he gave them manna. They whined because they didn't have meat and he gave them meat, and now they were whining again. They came to Samuel and they whined, "We want a king. Everybody else gets a king. We want a king." Does this not sound like a child? We want a king. Everybody else gets a king. Why can't we have a king? And God listened to them. Now, I don't know about you. I personally never said anything like, "Everybody else gets one, what? One." But I had 3 kids, and I would hear that occasionally. I remember when they were in high school, 3 of them in high school, and they wanted a car so that they didn't have to take the bus. And I said, "Sure, no problem." I said, "You can have my old SUV sometimes, or you can have the farm truck." No, that wasn't good enough. Everybody else gets a car, but no, everybody else, and we lived in Ancaster, a little rich, everybody else gets a Beamer or a Mercedes or a Volvo. We want one of those. I said, "Truck's right there if you want it." Sometimes we get whining. We want what everybody else has, even if it's not the best thing for us. God heard the people of Israel. "You want a king? I'll give you a king. But listen, you should know what you're getting into. He's going to want you to work hard for him, to make himself look good. He's going to make your children his servants. He's going to take the best of the best, even if it's yours. Are you sure you want a king? And what do we hear them answer? We want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations. But the second part, they say, is prophetic. We want a king to lead us and to go out before us and fight our battles. But hadn't God already done that for them already? Hadn't he led them out of Egypt, through the desert? Hadn't he led them and fought their battles? But they demanded. Their lower story demanded that they wanted a flesh and blood, physical king to lead them. And they rejected God's leadership in favor of this. So God gave them a king, a strapping young man. It says in the Bible that he was a handsome man, Saul, chosen from the tribe of Benjamin, the least of the least. And Samuel gives them this last bit of advice before he hands over the leadership to Saul. He says, don't forget to follow the Lord. Pay attention. Don't pay attention to idols. And we read in our story that it says, after Samuel's stern warning, Saul attempted to reign successfully, but he seemed always to be one step behind common sense. When facing battle, he failed to measure the strength of the enemy, then impulsively took matters into his own hands while waiting for Samuel. What sort of king was this? Saul did lead them into battle, and there were times he was victorious, and sometimes he lost. But even when he was victorious, he didn't do what God had said. God wanted him to go up against the Amalekites. God wanted him to destroy the Amalekites and everything they had. But Saul said, oh no, perhaps I'll just keep a little bit, the spoils of war. I'll keep the very best for myself. And when Samuel challenged him on it, he backpedaled. He gave evasive, well, I was just saving them for sacrifices. Yeah, for sacrifices. He wasn't being obedient to God. And in those moments, the people of Israel fell hard again. Saul stood tall, like a king, and the people of Israel fell hard. Standing tall, straight, and confident is one thing, but standing tall with pride, with arrogance, is something else entirely. Here we see Saul being arrogant. And what do they say? Pride goes before a fall. When we are arrogant, when we think we know better than God what we should do, inevitably it leads to trouble. How often have we heard that in the story in the last few weeks? But if we are humble and obedient, God hears us, God is with us. Arrogance or obedience, it's our choice. Today we are remembering those who stood tall. We have seen pictures. We saw it today. Back straight, heads held high. But I'd ask you, Dave and Olivia, were you taught arrogance or obedience? Yeah, obedience. Because your leaders knew that if you were obedient, you stood a greater chance of survival. Today we are remembering those who fought. We are remembering those who died, but we're also remembering those who survived. And we ask ourselves the age-old question, why? Why? Why, if our cause is right, do we have to go to war? Why, if our cause is right, do we have to kill? Why, if our cause is right, do we have to die? In the last few weeks, you will have read a great deal about wars, and you will have read about God leading his people into war and annihilating and destroying entire nations. And we struggle with why our God would allow that to happen. More than that, why God seems to want it to happen. Trust me, this is something that theologians and everyday people have struggled with, have wondered about for centuries. And I will admit, I have had some serious questions to God about why this has happened. Somehow, it doesn't seem right. And to our finite minds, it doesn't. But there's God's mind, God's story, and how it will unfold. Many people make the mistake of reading what the Bible says in Exodus 20:13, "You shall not kill," and seeking to apply this command to war. However, the Hebrew word literally means the intentional, premeditated killing of another person with malice. Murder. God orders the Israelites to go to war against other nations, not murder them, not with malice, not because it was their wish, but because God had a story. War is never a good thing, but sometimes it's a necessary thing. In a world full of people who sin, sometimes war is inevitable. Sometimes the only way to keep sinful people from doing great harm to the innocent is to go to war. A couple of examples that we've read about in the last couple of weeks. The Canaanites were destroyed by Israel, wiped out, men, women, and children. But the Canaanites were a sinful people, an immoral people, a people who would regularly, routinely sacrifice their own children to their pagan gods. And God wouldn't let that evil continue in his world. The Amalekites that we read about in this chapter, that God ordered destroyed, they had ambushed God's chosen people as they came out of Egypt, and God promised then that they would be avenged, that there would be repercussions. Throughout the Bible, warfare is presented as a grim reality in a cursed world. The forces of evil must be stopped, and bloodshed is sometimes the result. And it tells us in Ecclesiastes 3, there is a time and season for everything, including war. Today, no nation has a command from God to wage war, whether they say it or not. God is not handing out a battle plan like he did for Joshua and Samuel and Saul. Yet, wars continue to be fought. It is part of a fallen world's experience and existence. And people who go off to war are indeed challenged. The Bible never condemns the actions of a soldier following orders, being obedient on a battlefield. In fact, the New Testament has examples of soldiers who had faith in God. Jesus commended a centurion's faith in Matthew 8:10. And another centurion, Cornelius, was saved in Acts 10. Those men of war were not rebuked for their profession, for performing their duties as centurions and soldiers. God never tells people to sin so that those